Hear, O Israel, Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh Elohim with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your might. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be in your heart. You shall impress them upon your children. You shall speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hands. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Shema Israel, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. ואהבת את יהוה אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבניך. ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשכבך ובקומך. וקשרתם לאות על ידך וחיו לטוטפות בין עיניך. וכתבתם על משושות ביתך ובשעריך.
Hallelujah. All right. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Okay, today, if you got the notes, today's message is about the times of the Gentiles. How many of you have had the times of the Gentiles explained to you before? Some say yes, some say not properly. Well, we'll find out. Luke chapter 21 and verse 24. Luke 21 and verse 24. Yeah, if you haven't heard this before, this might come as a surprise to you, that the term, the times of the Gentiles, appears in the Old Testament, and not in the book of Daniel, in the book of Genesis. All the way back at the beginning in the book of Genesis. Okay. The main thrust of this is that hopefully at least you'll understand, you think you know who the Gentiles are, but at least you'll find out who the Gentiles are. That the word Gentile in the scripture has more than one meaning, and there's more than one group of Gentiles. I'm going to show you that from the scripture. So in Luke 21:24, this is the Luke version of the answer to the question that the disciples had, when shall all these things be? And what shall be the sign of your coming? And the times of the Gentiles is one of those signs of his coming. And he says in verse 24, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword. So we know there are wars and rumors of wars and all of that. And be led away captive unto all nations. Who's that? Who's he talking about? Who's going to be led captive to all nations? Israel. Israel. Because, and why are they going to be led captive? That's the diaspora, or the scattering, the scattering of Israel because of their disobedience, primarily idolatry. Jerusalem shall be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are filled. So, this is the times of the Gentiles being filled is one of the signs of Yeshua's coming. So does anybody have a really good picture of the times of the Gentiles? When you read that in the context of what we're reading here, it sounds like the times of the Gentiles has to do with the trampling down of Jerusalem, doesn't it? And maybe you've been taught that the Gentiles are going to well, the scripture reveals that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, totally destroyed. So is that the times of the Gentiles? Well, let's take a look at this. The word for the times of the Gentiles, the word for the times, is melo. And it means fullness, the fullness of the Gentiles. Or it could be the multitude, the fullness. And the word, the translation for the times is not, it kind of misleads you. It makes it sound like, and really the Hebrew, if you check the Hebrew word is melo. It really doesn't have anything to do with time. Not anything at all to do with time. I'm going to show you in the Old Testament where that word was used, a very, very prominent place. Okay, then we have this word Gentiles. In the Greek, it's ethnos. Ethnos. Number 1484 in the Greek, Strong's Greek numbers. And it means tribe, foreign. And you notice in that definition, it says non-Jewish. Non-Jewish. Well, we would say non-Israelite, wouldn't we? Because we understand that the Jews are only one of the tribes of Israel. But it's a little bit more specific than that, as I'm going to show you from what Yeshua said. And in Hebrew, the word would be goy, or goyim, which can simply be translated nations. But it is also equivalent to this ethnos in that it is heathen people, heathens. What are heathens? They're the opposite of believers, or Yahweh walkers, faithful Yahweh walkers, right? So really, Gentiles doesn't have anything to do with whether they're Israelite or not. It has to do with their religion. So you could have a Gentile Israelite, because there were lots of Israelites who were following Greek ways, as we found out in intertestamental history, right? There are Israelites who were Hellenized and they were not following the law anymore, and they were Gentiles. And the purpose of the gospel was to bring those Gentiles, who should have been Yahweh's people, back to Yahweh. That's what the good news is. That's what the Tov Basar was, that the way was going to be made by the appearance of the Messiah to bring them back to Yahweh. So we have these three components of the times of the Gentiles: the melo, or the fullness of the nations, or of the heathen, whether they were Israelite or not Israelite. Now let's go and read this whole passage here from Luke chapter 21 and verse 7. They were asking Yeshua, saying, "Teacher, when shall these be?" Luke chapter 21 and verse 7. "What is the sign when this is about to take place?" Verse 8. And he said, "See that you are not led astray, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am, and the time is near." Now, that's a completely different word there for time. "Then do not go after them, but when you hear of fightings and unrests, do not be alarmed, for these have to take place first, but the end is not immediately." Then he said in verse 10 to them, "Nation shall rise against nation, reign against reign." And obviously how he's using nation here is as a kingdom, as a what we would call in our elementary school geography, countries, country against country, or nation against nation. Reign, kingdom against kingdom. "And there shall be great earthquakes in various places, scarcities of food, deadly diseases. There shall be horrors and great signs from heaven," which, we've talked about recently. "But before all this, they shall lay their hands on you, persecute you, delivering you up to the congregations and prisons, and be brought before sovereigns and rulers for my name's sake." Now, that actually did happen. If we were to continue the history of the early congregations, we would come to understand a little better, how did that split take place? How did Rome come to influence the messianic, if you will, the believers in Yeshua? Why did they come to hate them so much? And the believers in Yeshua were a sect of Judaism. How did they come to hate them so much, the Jews, the Yehudim? Why did they hate them so much that they kicked them out of fellowship? Because that's what they did. Pretty much that came about during the reign of Nero, the Roman Emperor Nero. And you remember, how many of you have ever heard the expression, Nero fiddled while Rome burned? Yeah, most everybody's heard that. Well, they don't know who started that fire. Some think that Nero started it himself because he wanted to burn down the way Rome was built then and rebuild it for himself. But he blamed who they called the Christians, the believers in Yeshua. That's who he blamed. And so they began to persecute, but they left the Yehudim alone. They just persecuted that one sect of the Yehudim. You probably didn't know that. And they blamed that on what they called the Christians, the Nazarenes, the ones who were followers of Yeshua. The Jews didn't want to have any part of that persecution, so they wouldn't have anything to do with that sect. They kicked them out. They kicked them out of the synagogues. They didn't like the fact that they said that the Messiah had come, but they hated worse that they were bringing the persecution of the Romans on Yehudim. Okay, so that happened, and a lot of the so-called Christians. That was a sneer word, by the way, but people are proud of that today, right? And yet that was originally attached to the believers in Yeshua as a slur. It was a slur word, but they're proud of it today. But a lot of them were dragged before the courts. Of course, they did drag them before the synagogues as well, and condemned by all. And Nero put thousands of believers in Yeshua. No doubt, we have no idea exactly how many, but thousands of them were put to death. They were martyred. So those are some of those people who are pictured as being under the altar, who are crying out, "How long before you avenge our blood?" Some of those believers. And of course, they really weren't under the altar, but it was a metaphor for, just like Abel's blood crying out to Yahweh for vengeance after he was killed by Cain. Abel's blood wasn't able to talk or think, so he wasn't really crying out, but it was the fact that that curse was crying out, that was coming on Cain. So all of these things were coming to pass. And at verse 13, it shall turn to you for a witness. Therefore, resolve in your hearts not to premeditate on what to answer. No need to do that. You don't have to have some ready-made speech that you keep in your pocket in case you're dragged before the government and you have to whip out that speech and read it, like most of those politicians have to read their speeches. No, Yahweh said, it'll be given to you what to answer. I shall give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries shall not be able to refute or resist. And you shall be betrayed by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you shall be put to death. And that certainly did happen, and it certainly could happen. He says he does tie it to the end time, so I think it's going to happen again. You shall be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head shall be lost at all, even though you're killed. A hair of your head's not going to be lost. Yahweh is going to keep track of that. Possess your lives by your endurance. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its laying waste is near. Then let those in Yehuda flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her go out. Let not those who are in the fields enter her, because these are the days of vengeance to fill all that has been written. And woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing children in those days, for there shall be great distress or tribulation. We visited that just recently. And wrath upon this people, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, by the Goyim, until the times of the fullness of the Goyim are fulfilled. Matthew 24 says something similar, but he doesn't talk about the times of the fullness of the Gentiles. Matthew 24:3, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the taught ones came to him separately, saying, "Say to us, then, when shall this be? And what is the sign of your coming in the end of the age?" And in verse 14, "And this Tov Basar, good news, of the reign shall be proclaimed in all the world as a witness to all nations." So when you read these two passages side by side, then you would think that the preaching of the Tov Basar to all nations as a witness would go out to all nations. Gentiles, if you will, goyim. And then the end shall come. So you might attach that to the fullness of the Gentiles. So when you see the abomination that lays waste, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, set up in the set-apart place, he who reads, let him understand. For then there shall be great distress, here's that same terminology, such as has not been since the beginning of the world till this time, nor ever shall be, great pressure. And immediately after the distress of those days, here are those heavenly signs, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, and the stars shall fall from the heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And that's just a week or so away, because we all know that the rapture is going to take place a week from next Sabbath, right? Yeah, okay. Everybody's on the same page. And the sign of the Son of Man shall appear in the heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth shall mourn, and they shall see the Son of Adam coming on the clouds of the heaven. Acts chapter 1, right? With power and much esteem. See, this is a compression of something that is going to be uncompressed. It's going to exfoliate, exfold. And he shall send his messengers with a great sound of a trumpet, a yam teruah, and they shall gather together his chosen ones from the four winds, from the end of the heavens to the other. And so there are a lot of things that are really compressed in this statement of Yeshua in Matthew 24. Now, think about this term, Gentiles. And let's look at Matthew chapter 10 and verse 5, and let's explore Gentiles a little bit further. See if we can figure out what this times of the Gentile or fullness of the Gentiles might be talking about. Matthew 10:5. Yeshua sent out his 12. You recall this, having commanded them, saying, do not go into the way of the Gentiles, goyim. Do not enter into a city of the Shomerites, the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So here's a group of Gentiles, heathens, unbelievers that Yeshua says don't go to, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So if the lost sheep of the house of Israel could be classified in one way of thinking as Gentiles, right? Then he's saying don't go into the way of the Gentile. He's not talking about, in this use of Gentile, he's not talking about Israelites who have gone astray from Yahweh. But now we're going to see him use the term Gentile when he's talking about those who have gone astray. So you have to look at the context of how the word is being used in order to determine, well, which kind. I mean, it can be confusing, can't it? Unless you really explore this, it can be awfully confusing. Just who are the Gentiles? I mean, most everybody. I don't think the Jews have as much problem as Christians who are trying to study this, because I think the Jews know that non-believers, even though they have Israelite blood, can be classified as Gentiles, but most everybody else doesn't. You know, most people think that America is Gentiles, but they think that they're Gentiles because they're not Israelites. They are Gentiles, but they are Israelite Gentiles because we are a nation that's not walking in the ways of Yah. That's strange, isn't it? I mean, that can make you do double takes and almost give you whiplash to think about it that way. But this is what Yeshua is saying. Matthew 15 and verse 22. Matthew 15 and verse 22. And see, a woman of Canaan came from those borders and cried out to Yeshua, saying, have compassion on me, O Master, Son of David. My daughter is badly demon-possessed. But he did not answer her a word. And his taught ones came and asked him, saying, well, actually, it doesn't sound like a question. Send her away. Sounds like a demand. Send her away because she cries after us. And he answering said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, when Yeshua says this, if you go on and read this, does Yeshua end up casting out this demon? Yes, he does. And why was that? What is he demonstrating here? He's saying that this woman is a Gentile, not because she's not a believer, but because of her lineage. But on the other hand, he's not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He accepts her as one of the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So what is he demonstrating? He's demonstrating what we can see in other scriptures, and we will see that it is possible for even non-Israelites to be grafted in. And when they are grafted in, then they are the children of Israel. And they are Yahweh's. Isaiah chapter 42. Isaiah 42. So that's a, there's a nuance of a revelation from Yeshua that most people totally miss. Totally miss. And of course they, as Christians would like to think of their Jesus as being wishy-washy and doing away with his father's laws anyway, right? So they don't want to think of him as being a true blue Yahudim. Isaiah 42:1. See, my servant, and that's capitalized because who's that referring to? It's Yahweh talking through Isaiah, but he's speaking the words of Yahweh. Who is Yahweh's servant? Capitals, Yeshua, whom I uphold, my chosen one, again capitals because it's Yeshua, my being has delighted in. And we were reading in Matthew and Luke, after Yeshua's immersion, he comes up out of the water, and a voice comes from the heaven and says, what? This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So he's delighting in him, all right? So he's talking about Yeshua. He brings forth right ruling to the Goyim, Hagoyim, to the nations. So here's a use in the Old Testament showing that Yeshua is going to bring right ruling to Hagoyim, but Yeshua said, I am not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So as Isaiah is using this term Goyim here, nations, Gentiles, is he talking about Israel? Because he says Yeshua is going to bring right ruling to them. And Yeshua said, I am not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So clearly, the lost sheep of the house of Israel are Gentiles. Goyim. Verse 2, he does not cry out, nor lift up his voice, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A crushed reed he does not break, and smoking flax he does not quench. He brings forth right ruling in accordance with truth. He does not become weak or crushed until he has established right ruling in the earth. And the coastlands wait for his Torah. See, even physical death is only temporary. Physical death is not the victory against Yahweh. The resurrection is the victory of Yahweh over death itself. Thus said in verse 5, thus said the El, Yahweh, who created the heavens and strengthened them out, or stretched them out, who spread forth the earth and that which comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it, and spirit, ruach, to those who walk in it. He says, I, Yahweh, have called you in righteousness. I take hold of your hand and guard you, and give you for a covenant to a people. That's Yeshua, right? Yahweh says, I'm going to take hold of your hand. I've called you in righteousness. I'm taking hold of your hand. I guard you. I give you for a covenant to the people, for a light to the Gentiles, to the Goyim. Yeshua said, I am not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The lost sheep of the house of Israel are Gentiles. To open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the prison, those who sit in darkness from the prison house. So here we're about to keep the fall festivals, and we're concluding in the keeping of these fall festivals the plan that Yahweh has for Israel first, and then the last great day, a judgment on the rest of the people. The ones who have not joined themselves to Israel, either by blood or by commitment. So here, and Isaiah is about the Messianic kingdom to come. To open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the prisons, those who sit in darkness from the prison house. So you see, you look at that word Gentile as it's used here, you see it's used as Israel. Lost sheep of the house of Israel. So can Gentile mean lost sheep of the house of Israel? And can it also mean those who have nothing to do with Yahweh, Yahweh's walk, or the blood of Israel? Yes, it can. You have to look at the context. And you have to determine, using Yahweh's Ruach, to guide you in that context to find out what he's talking about. Ezekiel chapter 4. Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 13. Yahweh said, even so the children of Israel shall eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles. Well, here Gentile obviously has the meaning of non-Israelites. Not just non-believers, non-Israelites. To whom I drive them. Because Yahweh drove Israel, disobedient Israel, the disobedient wife, when he cast her out, he drove them to be dispersed among aliens, true Gentiles. Now, when I say aliens, I don't mean extraterrestrial, okay? I just mean non-blood Israelites. And then they became Gentiles, just like those Gentiles, except their big sin was idolatry, okay? Hosea chapter 8 and verse 8. Hosea chapter 8 and verse 8. Israel has been swallowed up. They have now become among the Gentiles. And they actually became Gentiles. As a vessel in which is no pleasure. We're going to sing Father's Heart for Sue at the end today, because we're going to see that Yahweh, even though he has no pleasure in Israel as Gentiles, he has pleasure in Israel because they are Israel. Okay? Micah chapter 5. Micah chapter 5 and verse 8. And the remnant of Yaakov shall be among the Gentiles. So when they're among the Gentiles, they're not the Gentiles in reference here, but they actually become Gentiles because they become absorbed by the Gentiles. In the midst of many peoples, like a lion among the beasts of a forest, like a young lion among flocks of sheep, who, if he passes through, he shall both tread down and shall tear, and there is no one to deliver. There is no one to deliver, not fleshly, but there is one to deliver, and that is Yeshua. Now notice this in Genesis. Here we come to the term that I really wanted to come to in the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 48. Genesis 48. Now most of you, if we say Genesis 48 and we ask you what is that, and most of you probably have read this enough to be able to respond. That's the blessings of Jacob on the two sons of Joseph. Genesis 48:16. So Joseph in Egypt has his family come down to him, save them from the famine. Yaakov is very aged, and when he thinks that he's about to die, he's going to pass out. In chapter 49, he also tells what's going to happen to all his other sons, but he asks Joseph, his favorite son, to bring his two boys, Yaakov's grandchildren, Manasseh and Ephraim. And which one is older? No, Manasseh is older. Manasseh's the oldest. So Manasseh should get the blessing of the firstborn, right? And Ephraim is the younger. So he calls these two lads and he puts his hands on them. And he says, the messenger who has redeemed me from all evil, Yaakov speaking, bless the youths. And let my name be called on them, and the name of my fathers, Avraham, Yitzhak. And let them increase to a multitude in the midst of the earth. And when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, which is the first right blessing, it was evil in his eyes. And he took hold of his hand to remove it from the head of Ephraim to the head of Manasseh. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this one over here is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But Yaakov refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also becomes a people, and he also is great. And yet his younger brother is greater than he, and his seed is to become the completeness of the nations. It's exactly the same term as the times of the Gentiles. Did you ever know that? Ephraim is to become as the King James translators translated, and even the ISR translators translated it, in Luke chapter 21 and 24, the times of the Gentiles. But here it's not translated that way, is it? It's the completeness. Same word as the times. The completeness of the Goyim. Ephraim is going to be the completeness of the Goyim. And Yeshua said one of the signs of his coming is the completeness of the Goyim. And who is that? Ephraim. So what could that possibly mean? It's the same word. Melo. Strange, isn't it? You go back to the beginning. You always have to go back to the beginning to find out what the end is. So what could that possibly have to do? And I believe, and I think most of you believe, that Manasseh is Britain and Ephraim is the United States. Now, you can look at this also and you could say it is translated, I think, in the King James as the multitude or as a company of nations. And we've looked at this and we've said, well, there was a big preacher back some time ago that some of us followed, and he said that Ephraim was Britain because they were a commonwealth of nations. But you look at the United States, we call all of these little entities that we've got around states, but they're like little nations. They're like a multitude of nations, and we are younger than the British Empire. And we have our own little empire, not so little. But has there ever been a nation greater? We don't think so. I mean, study world history. The Roman Empire was mighty in that area, but have we been influential in even all of those areas where the Roman Empire was influential? Plus the rest of the world. Now, we're faltering, and we're bound to falter because we don't obey Yahweh. If we were in Yahweh, this would just about be the millennium. But also, what could this mean? The fullness of the nations. What could it mean with regard to the United States? Not just in our power and our sphere of influence, but when it comes to the word of Yahweh, which contains the Tov Basar, who has been the most influential in spreading the book, even though we don't really understand it, but spreading this book that contains the covenant. This is the book of the covenant. And who has been influential in putting this in more hands across the face of the earth than the United States? Britain has been influential, but not as influential as American evangelism. You know, we talk about, well, should we evangelize? Well, we should evangelize by displaying the works of Yahweh in our lives, and then when people see it, they should ask, and when they find out who our Elohim is, who our mighty one is, they should lust after that mighty one. But you know, there aren't very many of us, and they certainly don't lust after Christianity. That's not where it's at, because that's not the truth. So there you have, in the New Testament and going back to the beginning in the Old Testament, the same phrase. And it definitely applies to Ephraim in the blessing from Yaakov to Joseph's son Ephraim. Deuteronomy chapter 33. Deuteronomy chapter 33. So this kind of gives you a whole different insight to the times of the Gentiles that you were taught in Christianity, doesn't it? It means a whole bunch of different things than what we were taught when we first learned about the times of the Gentiles. Deuteronomy 33 and 13. And Joseph, he said, and of Joseph, he said, blessed of Yahweh is his land. Or, yes, with the choicest from the heavens, with the dew and the deep lying beneath, with the choice fruits of the sun, with the choice yields of the months, with the finest of the ancient mountains, with the choicest of the everlasting hills, with the choicest of the earth and all that fills it, and the good pleasure of him who dwelt in the bush, the bush where the fire was that Moses saw. Let it come on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. His splendor is like a firstborn bull, and his horns are like the horns of the wild ox. With them he pushes the peoples to the ends of the earth, and they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. That is quite a blessing. That almost sounds like a description of the fullness of the Goyim, doesn't it? 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 32. 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 32. They also feared Yahweh, and from every class they made for themselves priests of the high places. They made for themselves. So they didn't really follow the line of Aaron and the Levites. Ephraim didn't, sadly. You know, the Yahudim tried to, but in Samaria, which really was the northern Israel, which was called by what name? Joseph said, let them be called by my name, Israel. And Ephraim was part of that. And they made their own priesthood. Jeroboam made his own priesthood. They were fearing Yahweh. They were fearing Yahweh, but they were mixing. And they were serving, at the same time, their own mighty ones, according to the ruling of the Goyim, from among whom they had been exiled. So what mighty one do we fear? We have it on our coins. The mighty one of luck. The mighty one of luck. We trust in our money. It's going to be our money that's going to cause us to recover from Harvey. It's our money that's going to allow us to recover from Irma. It's what we always look to. It's our money that allowed us to recover from 9/11. Our senators and our leaders spoke words of the Scripture. We will rebuild. We'll fix it all. We'll be better. We'll come up stronger. And they're saying the same thing. They're saying the same thing about these disasters that we've just suffered. To this day, they are doing according to the former rulings. They are not fearing Yahweh, nor do they follow their laws, nor their right rulings, or the Torah and command which Yahweh had commanded the children of Yaakov, whose name he made Israel. So we've had these disasters. A few people probably think of them as wake-up calls. But guess what? We didn't stay awake very long, did we? We didn't stay awake very long after 9/11. And we're still not awake. No one is saying, that the only way we're going to really recover from this is to turn to Yahweh. Judah is resistant to accepting Messiah. Ephraim, think about this now, Ephraim is resistant to accepting that Torah, indeed, all of the Tanakh, is valid and necessary as a way of life. Anybody not believe that statement? These beliefs are what keeps the two houses apart. Now, when we read Ezekiel, and we read about the coming resurrection and the restoration of Israel back to the land, it is the resurrection of the whole house of Israel, including Judah and Ephraim, including the southern tribes and the northern tribes, and it's the restoration of both of those houses together back into one. This is, if anybody still wonders about James Block's music, it's what James Block sings about. It's about the joining of those two sticks and about the unification, the beginning of the millennium. Almost every one of his worship services are about the rejoining of those two houses back to the land. Tremendous purpose given. Jacob's wife, Joseph's wife, Moses, the wife of Moses, Rahab, Ruth, David's grandmother, Bathsheba, David's wife, Naamah, the Ammoritess, which was one of the wives of Solomon. What do these women demonstrate? What do they demonstrate? The efficacy of grafting in non-Israelites. When non-Israelites are grafted in, it's, as far as Yahweh is concerned, it's like they were always there. Like they were always Israel. They're true Israelites. They're not Israelites with an asterisk. If they come into like Ruth, my mighty one, your mighty one will be my mighty one. Your Yahweh will be my Yahweh. It's just like, he doesn't even pay any attention to their background. That's the whole key. So it's about the grafting in. Now look in Romans chapter 11 and verse 11. Do you think Paul understood this? I think Paul understood this. This is, it's demonstrated perfectly well that Paul understood the Old Testament, never rebelled against the Old Testament, never rebelled against the law. So you've got to read all of his writings knowing that he is fully engaged in Torah. And so what you're reading that sounds like he's against the law is not talking about the written law. He's against the oral law. Romans 11:11. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Speaking of Israel, let it not be. But by their fall, deliverance has come to the Goyim, to the Gentiles. Which Gentiles is he talking about? Is he rebelling against Yeshua and now going to not the lost sheep of the house of Israel? when we plainly saw that Yeshua can use the term both ways, when we plainly know that Paul was following in the footsteps of Yeshua and was taught by him, what Gentiles is he talking about? When we read the history of the Jews in the Roman world, we find that there were Jews, there were Yahudim everywhere who had been assimilated into the Gentile way of life. They're the ones that Paul was really concerned about bringing back. Now, if somebody came along and they were not Israelite, but they were willing to follow Yahweh, they would be grafted in. They would be grafted in. To provoke them to jealousy. Who was he trying to say should be provoked to jealousy? The ones who were calling themselves Jews, but didn't believe in Messiah, missed the Messiah, actually called out for his death. They were the scribes and the Pharisees, many of whom were converted, but many more who were not. Those are the ones that he wanted, the ones who were not converted. Those are the ones who he wanted them to be jealous. And instead they became vindictive. And if their fall is riches for the world and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their completeness? There's that phrase again. How much more their completeness? For I speak to you, the Gentiles, those who are not practicing what you should be practicing, inasmuch as I am an emissary to the Gentiles, which Yeshua was. I'm not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I esteem my service, if somehow I might provoke to jealousy those who are my flesh. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, and save some of them. So Paul is addressing this same grafting in. In Exodus chapter 12 and verse 49, Exodus 12:49, we read this every year at Passover time. There is one Torah for the native born and for the stranger who sojourns among you. Now this word, stranger, is not goyim or goy. It's ger. And it's a sojourner. But again, it speaks to the grafting in. If this person that sojourns among you is willing to follow the practices as you follow Torah, then they are no longer a stranger, and they have the same requirements that you do. There's one law for the native born and one law for the stranger, someone who comes and dwells among you. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 15. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 15. But Yeshurun grew fat and kicked. That's another term for Israel. You grew fat, you grew thick. You are covered with fat. So he forsook Eloah, who made him, and scorned the rock of his deliverance. Who's the rock of our deliverance? Yeshua. And this is in Deuteronomy, and so this is the prophecy. And so you skip ahead to the time of Yeshua, and that's exactly what they did, didn't they? They scorned the rock of their deliverance. They moved him to jealousy with foreign matters, with abominations. They provoked him. They slaughtered to demons and not to Eloah. Mighty ones they did not know. New ones who came lately. This really sounds like modern Israel. Which your fathers did not fear. You neglected the rock who brought you forth and forgot the El who fathered you. And by latching on to a Savior with a Greek name, they have forgotten the El who brought them. And some of them don't even like to hear the name of the Father. They want to think of a different Father. Genesis 48 and 19, again, finally. Genesis 48 and 19. Joseph refused to put his right hand on the head of Manasseh. And he said, I know, my son, I know. He also becomes a people, and he is also great. And yet this younger brother is greater than he, and his seed, Ephraim, is to become the completeness of the nations, is to become what in the New Testament is called the times of the Gentiles, but it's really quite a mistranslation. It should say the same thing here. The time of the end is going to be after the completeness of the nations through Ephraim. So the whole book of Scriptures is written to Israel, either obedient or disobedient. The fullness and flowering of Ephraim today is a sure sign that the end is not far away. May Yahweh bless you and guard you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you and give you his favor. May Yahweh lift up his countenance over you and give you his peace. Yivarekecha Yahweh vayishmereka, Ya'er Yahweh panav leka v'kaneka, Yasal Yahweh panav leka v'yasem leka shalom. You'll never look at the times of the Gentiles the same again, will you? All right. Now we're going to sing before Torah today. We are going to sing Israel. Israel, page 9. Page 9. And then, Willie, you got Torah, right?